Welcome to EPG Padashala. I am Dr. Vamshi Krishna Reddy, Assistant Professor of English, Indian Institute of Technology, Tirupati. This module is about minority and subaltern studies. This module would look at subaltern studies from culture studies point of view. Subaltern studies has been one of the most pioneering interdisciplinary subject or theory in the areas of history, political science, sociology, and culture studies. In this module, we would look at various issues of subaltern studies, history, evolution, who are the major players in the subaltern studies, and what are the major criticism against subaltern studies. Let us proceed with the module. Subaltern studies is a field of academic inquiry closely associated with cultural studies and post-colonial studies. Subaltern studies began as a trend in history writing in the 1980s, counterposing colonial nationalist Marxist historiography. So essentially, subaltern studies emerged as a counter theory or counter history writing against the existing dominant history writing from the perspectives of colonial, nationalist, and Marxist historiography. Subaltern studies project followed an essential model called history from the below or history from the margins. It believed that mainstream history writing, which are colonial, Marxist, and nationalist writings, have ignored various stories, writings of margins. Hence, subaltern studies started concentrating and started bringing out the unwritten history, ignored history, and brought it into the light. This module is going to discuss subaltern studies as a collective, and it traces the history of the term subaltern, and we would also discuss the subaltern writing versus elitist history writing, and then we would move on to subaltern historiography as a critique of colonial, nationalist, and Marxist historiography. Then we would be looking at different phases of subaltern studies project and criticism against subaltern studies. The term subaltern studies in its present theoretical sense began to be in vogue in academics with publication of series of edited volumes on modern Indian history, beginning with subaltern studies, writing on Indian history and society in 1982. Ranjit Guha, an Indian historian then working at University of Sussex, was the series editor of first 6 volumes and most influential figure behind this project. Until volume 9, Guha and 8 other South Asian scholars like Shahid Amin, David Arnold, Partha Chatterjee, David Hardiman, Gnanendra Pandey, Gautam Bhadra, Dipesh Chakraborty, Sumit Sarkar, who incidentally left the group later. The series has produced 12 volumes till date, excluding independent works by scholars associated with the project. Subaltern studies, which was once the name of a series on Indian history, has now become a general term for a field of study closely associated with post-colonial and culture studies. Influence of subaltern studies series has crossed the disciplinary boundary of history writing. It has got global presence that goes beyond India and South Asia as an academic specialization. The series made noteworthy contributions to contemporary critique of nationalism and history, Orientalism and Eurocentrism, and thereby provided new insights and critical edge to various disciplines within social sciences and humanities. Now, let's proceed further to trace the history of the term subaltern. Medieval England, the term subaltern meant a servant or peasant. In 17th and 18th century, subaltern was used to designate soldiers of inferior rank or foot soldiers. The term started acquiring political and theoretical significance after it is being used by Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci in his text Prison Notes. Gramsci used the term as a substitute for class to refer to working class and oppressed class. When the term subaltern was used by Ranjit Guha and his collective in the Indian context, they used it in a manner similar to that of Gramsci. But in a broader sense, it was not just limited to working class. For Guha and Subaltern Studies Collective, the term meant all sections of society who are oppressed, subordinated, and voiceless for different reasons. So, Subaltern Studies in Indian context is not just about working class history, but also to bring out history of oppressed, exploited class into the limelight. And Subaltern Studies project was essentially against elitist writings of history. Hence, it focused more on the history of oppressed classes. Guha used the conceptual category of elite and counterposed it with subaltern. For Ranjit Guha, all those who are not elite are subaltern. With the reference to the Indian history, Ranjit Guha argues that the British was elitist and the people who are supporting the British rule were elitists, such as Indian landlords, feudal, dominant upper caste groups, English educated upper class, upper middle class, and this class could become part of bureaucracy and can be considered as elites. Anybody who is in a hegemonic position, who is holding power, has the privilege of access to power or authority, can be considered as elite. All those who are marginalized, voiceless, oppressed, and without an agency due to their class, caste, religious, psychological, gender, sexual identities are subaltern. Hence, all the classes that I have mentioned just now are got space in subaltern writings. In that sense, working classes, Dalits, minorities, disabled, women, LGBT groups, etc. can be considered as subalterns. Guha identified two kinds of elitist historiography in the Indian context. The first is colonial historiography, the second is nationalist historiography. Now, let us move further to see how subaltern historiography as a critique of colonial, nationalist, and Marxist, even Marxist historiography. Subaltern Studies project emerged as a counter-narrative to colonial and nationalist historiography. It also critiqued Marxist historiography to a certain extent. Some scholars even define subaltern studies as a trend in the history writing which emerged in the 1980s against colonial, nationalist, Marxist historiography. Subaltern Studies project identified a blind spot in all the above mentioned historiographies. None of the historiographies take into account the politics of people into account. Hence, Subaltern Studies allege that dominant historiographies such as colonial, nationalist, and Marxist historiographies do not consider oppressed class history as history. Now let's look at colonial historiography. Each of the historiographies has their own master narratives. The colonial historiography has its own base, the civilizing mission. For the colonizers, colonized are uncivilized masses, and the colonizers' mission was to civilize and enlighten them. All the happenings during Indian anti-colonial struggle were seen from this perspective of the master narrative in colonial historiography. And then, Subaltern Studies critiqued nationalist historiography. What is nationalist historiography? Nationalist historiography emerged as a tool which can be effectively used in anti-colonial struggle. Their aim was the formation of nation state. Hence, nationalist historiography always worked towards forming a nation state through history writing. They tried to construct an identity of Indians and also try to invent a glorious past prior to colonialism for India. In other words, it was politically integrated to the making of nation state. The other key historiography which was critiqued by Subaltern Studies group is Marxist historiography. This historiography has its master narrative of formation of socialist state. For them, all the movements eventually leads to revolution and creation of socialist state. Even though Subaltern Studies collective to large extent was left and used left theoreticians, they were critical of Marxist historiography of India. According to Marxist historiography, the semi-feudal India got colonized by British, thereby got politicized and achieved independence. Subaltern Studies is critical of the focus of such historiography on the political consciousness of the elites who in turn inspired the masses to rebel against colonizers. Hence, so far we have looked at three historiographies: colonial, nationalist and Marxist historiographies, which were critiqued by Subaltern collective. Subaltern Studies project points out that elitist historiographies considered the movements of masses, the peasants, the tribals, the working class, or the masses, ordinary people in general, as pre-political in nature and did not take into consideration of politics of people. Hence, Subaltern Studies wanted to take into account the politics of the people. So, Subaltern Studies is built on the politics of the people. By politics of people, they meant the agency of the people. They wanted to establish the agency of the people, masses, as makers of their own history. Subaltern Studies project proclaimed that existing historiographies never understood the people's movement as a thing in itself or as self-substantiating. They never take into consideration the people's movement as having an agency or identity of its own. People's rebellions were read as part of a larger colonial, nationalist or socialist project. Subaltern Studies started as an attempt to read people's rebellion in itself. It tried to see what initiatives, ambitions were involved in the making of rebellion by people. Now, so far we have looked at the foundations of Subaltern Studies and the criticism against colonial, Marxist and nationalist historiography. Let's look at different phases of Subaltern Studies as a project. Subaltern Studies project has produced 12 volumes till date, excluding independent works done by different scholars. From analysis of these works, we can delineate two phases in this project. The first phase, which was roughly till 6th volume, was concerned with question of subaltern versus elite. The second phase moved on to discourse analysis. The first phase. Let us look at the first phase. The attempt at this phase was to identify an autonomous domain of subaltern action, and it attempted to explore the agency of the subaltern in relation to elite. The first phase, in a sense, established an autonomous domain for the subaltern, and it deassociated the domain from the bourgeois Congress and nationalist activities during independence movement. The Subaltern Studies initiatives made it clear that Congress nationalism was not the only form of resistance or nationalism existed in colonial India. Congress nationalism was seen as the dominant nationalism which tried to subjugate and assimilate the masses into their fold for the formation of nation state. It tried to unfold the existence of popular domains of popular rebellions which were in contradiction with the dominant nationalist thought, and many a times it showcased opposition to dominant thought. To establish an autonomous domain of subaltern resistance through historiography was an extremely arduous task, as it was difficult to locate sources about the subaltern in South Asian societies, as a Western notion of record keeping never existed here. There is no records which belong to the people. So they attempted to find sources, materials in popular, private and local sources. They look at oral traditions as serious historical materials. They also try to analyze the dominant records and read them against the grain and between the lines. So here they would, Subaltern Studies also look at the dominant historiography and try to decode the message and try to read between the line. The use of dominant official records and archives and reading them critically posed a theoretical and political problem. Many argued that tracing the voice of the subaltern through dominant narratives cannot bring out subaltern voice to the forefront. The pre-discourse subalterns could not be located through the dominant narratives posed a theoretical problem in the first phase, because the dominant narratives were, of course, either colonial or nationalist historiography or archives. This constraint in a way paved way to move towards discourse analysis, which constitutes a second phase of Subaltern Studies project. So far, in the first page, we were discussing about positioning Subaltern Studies as a history against elitist history. In the second phase, the Subaltern Studies moved onto discourse analysis. Here, aim was not just unearthing subaltern voices or subaltern action, but to engage or to reread the dominant narratives. In the second phase, subaltern history writing tried to decode, try to deconstruct mainstream historical narratives. In this phase, Initially, the phase was influenced by Gramsci, Marx, and other Marxist theoreticians. In the second phase, the readings were regulated by post-structural, post-colonial, and post-modernist theoreticians like Michel Foucault and Edward Said. In the first phase, tried to show subaltern as makers of their own history. Second phase tried to bring to light the dominance which continue to be faced by subaltern sections in the society. So the later volumes discussed the issues such as caste, community, and gender. For the same, the project has moved on to the realm of culture and politics, and the methodology was cultural analysis. It was a move towards interdisciplinary rather than restricting the studies within purview of history and social sciences. Here, at this phase, subaltern studies moves from history writing to cultural analysis of the history. The essays on Hindu-Muslim rights, Dalit movements, gender issues bring to the forefront subject matters which were never seriously discussed by the historians. These attempts coincided with Dalit uprisings of 1990s, and they have great significance while taking into consideration of the rise in religious fundamentalism, atrocities against Dalits, women, and sexual minorities. In a way, the shift towards discourse analysis and the methodology of culture studies reformulates the idea of subaltern. Now let's look at the renewal or renewed energy of subaltern studies project towards subaltern studies and minority studies and Dalit studies. The first volumes of subaltern studies focused on peasant and mass uprisings. So within second phase of last two volumes concentrated issues of minority categories, whether in terms of gender, caste, or community. In the 11th volume, called Community, Gender, Violence, addresses new range of issues related to community, gender, and violence. The question of women and nation is explored, especially in relation to minority communities in the volume. 12th volume, Muslims, Dalits, and Fabrication of History, directly deals with the issue of minority communities in the subcontinent. It shows how dominant histories in India have been constructed and how it dealt with Muslim and Dalit subjects. The essays in the volume, like Shahid Amin's article representing the Musalman, Then and Now, Now and Then, M.T. Ansari's article Refiguring the Phonetic, Malabar, 1836 to 1922, Milind Wakankar, The Anomaly of Kabir, Caste and Canonicity of Indian Modernity, etc., dealt with Muslim and minority issues with proper material grounding and theoretical rigor. Now, so far we have discussed the foundations of subaltern studies and the subaltern studies critique of colonial, nationalist, and Marxist historiography. Let us look at some of the criticisms against subaltern studies before concluding the module. The subaltern studies, which radically thought to be the forefront of academic and political debates, the agency of subaltern sections, is not free from dissent and criticism, especially about its methodology and aspirations. One such criticism is from Sumit Sarkar, an initial member of collective who later disconnected himself from the group. In his essay, Decline from Subaltern in Subaltern Studies, he critiques that move of the project from social history to cultural history in the second phase. He criticizes the turn to post-structuralist, post-modernist, and post-orientalist theories by abandoning Marxist and empiricist foundation which was grounding initial volumes. He also points out that Foucauldian way of flight from the fact resulted in movement away from traditional material basis of history. In a sense, Sumit Sarkar differed with Subaltern Studies Collective on the basis of the fundamental ways of history writing. The other historians who differed with Subaltern Collective and Subaltern ways of history writing are Vivek Chibber and Romila Thapar. Vivek Chibber, in his book Post-Colonial Theory and Spectator of the Capital, provides what many scholars reviewed as the most comprehensive response to post-colonial theory focusing on subaltern studies project. He says that fundamental arguments of the project are based on series of analytical and historical misconceptions. His critique, mounted on part of radical Enlightenment tradition, claims that it is possible to affirm a universalizing theory without yielding to Eurocentrism and reductionism. He points out that possibility and necessity to conceptualize the South Asia or non-Western societies using the same analytical lens that is used to understand the developments of movements in the West. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, a person associated with the project, in her work, A Critique of Post-Colonialism Towards History of Vanishing Present, calls herself a critic of metropolitan post-colonialism. Well-known historian Romila Thapar has critiqued the methodology and approach of subaltern studies project. So far, subaltern studies or cult studies analysis in general, each study is self-contained, and at the same time, there will be large number of well-documented research works with underpinning political connection but without any outwardly visible cross-connections. Romila Thapar, in her article Interpretations of Indian History, Colonial, Nationalist, Post-Colonial, points out that attitude against generalization is problematic, as for her, completely avoiding generalization will lead to missing the complete picture. She also disagrees with axiom of project that all readings are equally significant and no need to prioritize readings. According to her, this makes the approach similar to 19th century historiography, which believed that all sources are equal. But she agrees with the project greatly impacted historiography of Third World and positively influenced comparative studies in the field of history internationally. To conclude, we can think about what were the attempts at providing theoretical binding for the overall project of subaltern studies. Ranajit Guha tried to provide an overarching theoretical and political amalgamation for the project right in his preface to the first volume itself. And Partha Chatterjee's Nationalist Thought and Colonial World and The Nation and Its Fragments, Colonial and Post-Colonial Histories also tried to theorize the project. The general characteristics of subaltern studies project, which editorial collective tried to figure out, can be summarized as follows. Their aim was to find out autonomous domain of the subaltern. This fundamental aim of subaltern studies is to find out the real history of the masses whose history has not been written. Hence, subaltern studies strive to bring out those histories which are not covered by mainstream historiographies such as colonial, nationalist, and Marxist historiographies. Hence, subaltern studies collective wanted to show that people were not looking forward or to just blindly following charismatic leaders like Gandhi, but in a way they were putting on their ambitions onto their leaders, which many a time was conflicting with each other, and it is evident in the incidents such as Chauri Chaura incident of 1922, where the masses thought their wish for rebellion was in accordance with Gandhi, but it was not. The subaltern domain was rooted in the traditional territorial, regional, and religious domains, while the elite domain was based on modern notions of politics, and it followed party politics' ambition towards democracy. Further, the subaltern domain was prone to violence as its method, and the elite domain was subjected to legalism as its method. In subaltern mode of mobilization or protest was always spontaneous, and elite mode of mobilization was scripted, planned, and guarded. Subaltern mobilizations were horizontal in nature, while elite mobilizations were followed by top leadership to Moses model. While the above mentioned attempts were trying to find out structure for the project and posits two domains of subaltern and elite, scholars like Sumit Sarkar has posited an in-between position that when he pointed out that these two domains were actually not separate as they are posited. According to him, they are intersecting, and the concept of passive revolution can support the same. The elite were actually trying to absorb the takeover subaltern energy towards their own aim of making a nation state. The later phase of discourse analysis moved forward from elite subaltern to question of tradition and modernity. Subaltern studies emerged as a trend in the history writing about the Indian subcontinent, and South Asia posited rigorous challenge to existing historical scholarship following the history from below model. It has crossed the disciplinary boundary of history, geographical boundary of South Asia. It influenced the formation of Latin American Subaltern Studies Association in North America, critically influenced history writing in many post-colonial societies. It has been translated into many Indian and foreign languages. Subaltern Studies, which was once the name of series of studies on Indian history, now has become the name of field of study, which deals with questions of different kinds of marginalization. Hence, this module discusses subaltern history writing as a field of study, not merely alternative history writing, as a field of study that challenged the mainstream historiographies such as colonial, nationalist, and Marxist historiographies, and emerged as a credible alternative that represents exploited and oppressed classes. This module covered various criticisms that was posed against subaltern studies and what are the strengths and weaknesses of subaltern studies collective. For further details, one can look at the e-text, and to read further, one can look at the references to get into more details about subaltern studies collective. Thank you.